You are listening to the podcast for English 122 for Writing a Strong Thesis. In this podcast, I'm going to spend some time expanding on what the book talks about for writing a strong thesis and adding in some new information. On the first slide, there's a list of the 4 things that the book introduces for how to write a strong thesis. It says a strong thesis will 1. Be arguable, 2. Be specific, 3. Be manageable, and 4. Be interesting. In order to make sure that your thesis is actually arguable, you should remember that your thesis needs to take a position on the subject rather than simply state the subject itself. You can double-check this by thinking about what that thesis will inspire others to do. For example, someone who reading that thesis and doesn't agree with it might be motivated to take a stand against it, such as challenging, disputing, or even outright opposing your thesis. If your reader's first response to your thesis is "so what" or "who cares," a kind of nonchalant response, then that probably isn't actually a position statement. And it may be that you have thought of a position in your head and you just haven't clearly communicated it within that thesis. So, you probably need to take some time to clarify, to forge a relationship between ideas, or to connect to a larger issue. Ultimately, your thesis should take a stand. If you're writing a paper correctly for this class, it's not just going to be a summary, but actually an argument. So you want to make sure that you have taken a stand in order to do that. A couple of examples, one that's doing this well and one that isn't, are at the bottom of the slide. A weak example of an arguable thesis is, my paper is about Facebook. While that may be true, it's really not the thesis of your paper because it's simply telling the reader what the topic is without telling them your stand. A stronger example, then, is Facebook is a useful tool for college students because it provides social and business networking opportunities. This is a much stronger thesis because it is arguable. It could prompt a debate or opposition from multiple people, and it actually tells your reader more clearly what your paper is about, so a much stronger thesis in a couple of different ways. The second trait for a strong thesis that your book mentions is that a strong thesis should be specific, and this happens in a couple of different ways. The first is that your thesis should focus on one main idea. Now, depending on the length of your paper, what one main idea might include could be a little bit different. So if you're writing a 3 to 5 page paper like you will be for assignment 2, you want to make sure that that one main idea is a little bit smaller. So if you're writing about the environment and you wanted to write about bottled water, you might be able to successfully write about how bottled water is bad for the environment and talk about a couple of different ways that bottled water is bad for the environment. However, if you were going to write a longer paper, then perhaps you could talk about bottled water, how it's negative for several reasons, and you could include in that maybe an environmental aspect and also a human health aspect, and bring up the hormones that sometimes plastic bottles leach into bottled water. So those are a little bit different, but it really helps you to think about the length of the paper and thinking about how much you should focus in on a specific idea. Another way to make sure that you are writing a strong, specific thesis is to avoid general and sweeping language like good, better, all, every, and none. Usually, these words are not going to be very clear to your reader. However, if you are writing some kind of an argument like a definition argument, where a part of your argument will be spent in explaining what those words mean, then those words may actually end up being very clear to your reader. However, if you aren't going to take time to explain to your reader what you mean by something being the best or something being the worst, it's better to use more concrete language. So an example of how this could work, if you look at the bottom of the slide, the weak example is, students do best when they are challenged. In that example, it's not entirely clear for your reader what exactly you're focusing on there. Do you mean that they do best in school? That they do best in life? That they do best after they've completed their education? It isn't very clear. In the stronger example, it says, teachers should create challenging classes because students who are challenged perform above academic expectations. In that example, it's much clearer where the focus of your argument will be, on those academic expectations. It also lets your reader know that there are academic expectations in place that you can compare to as you go through it. And it's clearer for you as a writer because it gives you a sense of focus for what exactly you're going to write about. The third aspect of a strong thesis, as mentioned in your book, is that it should be manageable. You should be able to develop the thesis within the required length of the paper. And that means that whatever thesis you end up writing, your argument that develops from it should be developed within the required length of the paper with enough clear reasons and evidence to successfully make your case. If you aren't able to do that, then your thesis is not manageable. So, for this 3 to 5 page paper that you're writing for assignment 2, you probably wouldn't be able to solve world hunger within that space. However, if you are interested in the topic of hunger, You can instead focus in on one specific country, and then maybe write about one specific plan to help alleviate hunger in that country. That's a lot more focused and probably more manageable for the length of the paper that you've been given. An example of a weak thesis in this area is athletes in college work harder than high school athletes because they are challenged on a mental, physical, and emotional level. You have three main areas in that thesis, mental, physical, and emotional, which would probably all need some explanation and some time to be well developed. You probably wouldn't be able to do that successfully in 3 to 5 pages. So a stronger example is, athletes in college must work harder than high school athletes because they are held to higher physical standards and are expected to practice more often. In this thesis, the author has focused in on the physical aspects and then broken them down into 2 specific areas that author is going to focus on. It's a much more manageable thesis for a 3 to 5 page paper. The fourth and final section from your book about how a thesis should be strong is that it should be interesting. This is an area that I think that writers often don't consider when they're thinking about academic arguments, that your thesis should be interesting. However, if you're picking a topic that isn't interesting to you and your thesis isn't going to be interesting to you, then this class is going to be a really long class. So hopefully when you're thinking about what you want to write about for A4 at least, you're picking something that's going to be interesting to you, and that will help you write a better paper because you'll be engaged. It will also help your audience be more engaged because they can be more interested in what you're writing about if you are. Part of writing an interesting thesis for your audience is making sure that your audience knows why it matters. So the so what question can also be useful here. A weak thesis that isn't very interesting is medical marijuana should continue to be legalized in Colorado. In that situation, it's not so clear to your reader why they should care. In the stronger example, it says, despite recent proposed legislation that threatens legalized medical marijuana provides benefits to terminally ill patients and should continue to be legalized to provide those benefits. In that example, it's much more specific about why this person who is writing it cares about medical marijuana, and the little tag at the beginning that talks about the proposed legislation threatening legalized marijuana gives it a sense of importance and lets the reader know that this is a timely issue that the author is considering in light of recent events. Far more interesting. Another aspect of strong thesis writing that isn't even mentioned in your book is that your thesis and your argument need to match. There is nothing that will more easily derail your reader than if your thesis doesn't seem to match with what the paper is about. Think back to that example we looked at for A1, the student example, and remember that her original thesis was that the argument was effective for the specific text that she had looked at, but then the majority of her argument was actually about how it wasn't very effective. As a reader, that's distracting and confusing. So you want to make sure that if you write your argument and you realize that your thesis no longer matches, that something is changing. Either you have to adjust your thesis to match your new argument, or you need to look at what you can do to fix your argument to more clearly match your thesis. I want to end this podcast by bringing up your previous experience with thesis statements. I realize that if you have gone through a K-12 system in the United States, and if you've been through ENG122 here, then you have probably had a lot of instruction on thesis statements. However, thesis statements are very, very important because they are kind of the guiding backbone for your paper. And if you don't understand how to write a strong thesis, it makes it harder to write a strong argument. So it's very important that we go over this again, even though it may be something that you've heard before. In addition, I find that a lot of my students have had previous instruction about thesis statements that I don't really agree with. So here are 5 lies that I think are common in the students that I've worked with that you've been told about thesis statements in the past and why they aren't actually true. The first one is that your thesis must come at the end of the first paragraph. This is usually a thesis statement lie that you've been told in regards to the 5-paragraph essay, like the kind you would do for an AP test or a standardized state test. Now, while that may be true for a 5-paragraph essay, which is a specific kind of writing, and it may be a good idea in that specific situation, it's not true for all kinds of writing, especially when you're writing a really complex argument. It may be important to explain to your reader a little bit about the background of your topic first, or you may need to lead up to your thesis. It may be some kind of cause and effect thesis where you first need to build some steps and then get to the thesis after you've built those steps. So it's okay if your thesis comes later on after the first paragraph. However, you want to make sure that you aren't saving your thesis until too long in the paper so that you lose your reader. It has to be early enough in the paper that it's clear what your argument is about so that people don't get lost, but you don't need to be stuck with it in that one specific place. Another lie that you have probably been told about thesis statements is that they must always be 1 sentence in length, no longer. If you are writing a 5-paragraph essay, and that's a very short paper, then probably 1 sentence should cover whatever you're going to say in that paper. However, we're going to be working on more complex issues and writing longer papers in this class. And if you are writing about a complex topic, then one sentence may not be enough to fully convey what you're going to be writing about. And I think students feel trapped by that sometimes. So sometimes I get these really, really long thesis statements like, even though the American public thinks eating disorders, which usually include anorexia, bulimia, and compulsive eating, are caused by the media and affect only women, eating disorders are far more complex and are usually a result of family pressures and increasingly affect men. And that's really long. So it's really fine for you to break it up into a couple of sentences if you need it. It will be easier for your reader to understand a complex idea if you're breaking it up into less complex segments. The next two lies that you've heard about thesis statements are related. The first one is you can't start writing until you have a perfect thesis statement. Most people don't know what they're going to write until they actually start writing it. That is incredibly common even for skilled and experienced writers. So, you definitely want to have a clear thesis statement to start your writing, but if it isn't perfect and if you think that it's probably going to change, that's fine. You just need to have a thesis statement so that you can get started. Relatedly, the fourth lie you've probably been told is that once you've started writing your paper with one thesis, you're stuck with it. If it's a timed essay that you're writing in an hour, then probably you want to hold tight to that thesis. But we're going to be doing papers that involve a lot of revision, and ultimately, like I said before, if you wind up with a thesis statement that isn't matching your argument, it's confusing for your reader, and you should probably change it. The fifth and final lie that I'm covering today is also a holdover from that 5-paragraph essay, and that's that thesis statements must always give 3 points of support. If you are writing an essay and it has 3 points of support, you may think that it's useful for your reader to know what those 3 points are going to be up front. However, you may not have 3 specific reasons. It may be 2 that you're going to develop really fully. It may be that it's not a good model for the kind of paper you're writing. If you're writing a cause and effect essay where there's just one cause and one effect, then giving 3 reasons may not be useful to you or to your readers. So you want to make sure that you're doing what's best for the purpose of your paper, what's best for the purpose of the type of argument you're working with, and what's going to be clearest for your reader. If that involves 3 reasons, then put them in there. And if it doesn't, you don't need to feel stressed into trying to make that work. So, as a review, the 4 parts of a strong thesis that we went over from your book were that a strong thesis should be arguable, be specific, be manageable, and be interesting. In addition, you want to make sure that whatever thesis you write ends up matching the argument that you've written to be off that thesis. And if it doesn't, something needs to change. Don't feel trapped by previous things that you've heard about thesis statements that were specific to one kind of paper. If they aren't going to work for the kind of paper that you're writing, then you shouldn't use those methods. And if you have any questions about that, I'm always happy to help you figure it out. We'll be working a lot on thesis statements, obviously, as we're writing several papers in this class. So do make sure that if you have any questions about thesis statements now, you're getting them answered early, and then it won't be something that's confusing you later on.